Hello everyone, this is Clayton. I just finished watching The Black Phone, starring Ethan Hawke, and directed by Scott Derrickson. So if you were wondering where Scott Derrickson was ever since Sam Raimi took over the reins for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, well, this is the film that Derrickson was working on after he passed on making that film. And when it comes to supernatural horror, this certainly does happen to fit more with Derrickson's previous film repertoire, especially given his work in the Sinister films. Especially considering that I'm really starting to see how scary Ethan Hawke can be when he's given roles like this, with both this and Moon Knight that I saw recently. Let's get to the story, shall we? The story centers around a 13-year-old boy named Finney Shaw, played by Mason Thames. Now, Finney is this smart but shy 13-year-old boy who's living in the 1970s and has to deal with bullies and with an abusive father who happens to make life hell for him and his little sister, who happens to have supernatural abilities to see things in her dreams. It's kind of like a Stephen King story in that sense. But when a traveling magician looking fellow happens to abduct Finney and put him in a sealed off room, he happens to find a phone that can listen in to the previous victims of this guy, and he has to follow their advice to see if he can manage to escape, or if he'll just be the latest victim of this sick creep who's keeping him in his room for a reason he doesn't understand. Now, the film doesn't exactly go into the specifics as to why Ethan Hawke's character, known as the Grabber, does what he does, but I think that's more up to interpretation, considering that the film doesn't give you all the answers, but it lets you see the film for what it is. Especially considering that I love the fact that Finney has to think about who to listen to and who not to throughout the film. And as a 13-year-old kid would do, sometimes he succeeds, sometimes he fails. He makes mistakes. He's got to try out a bunch of different tactics before a few of them eventually work. And even the ending of the film shows that the Grabber probably anticipated police involvement more than a lot of abductors would, considering he was thinking two steps ahead for a lot of things. Granted, there are a few things that I think some of the characters could have picked up on before they do, but for the most part, they're negligible. The horror of the film not only comes from the fact that these deceased kids can actually talk to Finney, but also because you never really know what the Grabber's thinking or what else he has up his sleeve. There are several times throughout the films where information is withheld from you in a natural way to the point where you don't know what's going on initially, but when you see all the pieces come together, you see how everything works out. And I'm like, yeah, I can see how this works out, and I can see how he's been able to go through it this long, and how he's been able to abduct these young boys so many times with no one catching on to him. Plus, Ethan Hawke is just creepy in the role. Of course, he was also creepy as Harrow in Moon Knight, but I think he's even worse here considering that, unlike Harrow, this is a character who feels like he could actually exist in real life, and he's able to emote pretty well even when most of his performance is hidden behind a mask. And when the mask is forced off of him, he covers his face anyways. So it could be up to interpretation as to why he wears this devilish mask and why he happens to always want to cover his face. It's it'll probably cause theory and analysis videos for a while. But at the same time, this is Finney's story, and for a child actor, he does really well in the role, as does his sister. But like I said, there are a few cringeworthy performances here and there are a few things that don't add up. But for the most part, this is a solid horror film from Scott Derrickson, and I'm glad he's able to return to his roots a bit here, stepping away from the big budget films and focusing more on a Blumhouse production that's not as expensive to make, but is definitely still pretty effective. That's why I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. See you next time.